Hello again, everyone. So for this video, we're going to look at the course of events that happened after the United States enters the war against Germany in April of 1917. Now, by the time the U.S. enters the war against Germany on April the 6th, 1917, things are going very badly for the Allies. After 3 years of nearly suicidal trench warfare on the Western Front and a different but decidedly but much even more disastrous campaign on the Eastern Front by the Russians, things are looking bad for the Allies. For 3 years, basically, the Allies have tried to break through the German lines by launching one frontal assault against the German trench lines, which again stretch all the way from the North Sea along the Dutch border, all the way southward to the Swiss border. And so for 3 years, the Western Allies, Britain and France, along with along with Canada, Australia, and various other colonial troops from all around the world, from Europe, from British and French colonies, had tried unsuccessfully at breaking through the German defenses. Typically, how these assaults would occur was predictably similar, as were predictably the tragic results that would follow. Basically, the thing that made World War I so horrific, and is one of the reasons why it's generally credited as having helped inspire the modern horror genre, is because of just the juxtaposition of new weapons and new technologies coexisting with both older, less advanced technologies and, in many cases, outdated thinking. Basically, the technology wasn't quite there to make the war less brutal than it was. Though there were several attempts to try to do so during the war. Notably in 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans began using poison gas against British and Canadian soldiers, and eventually everybody was using poison gas within a matter of months, including horrific variants like mustard gas that would produce blistering in the skin and would cause people's, blistering, and basically people would drown in their own, horrible stuff. And then the British developed the tank in 1916, 1917, to try to break through German trenches. But essentially, the lines of the war remained terribly static. Progress was measured not in terms of miles of enemy territory taken, but yards. In some cases, a few dozen yards was considered a massive breakthrough in these campaigns. And basically what you would have is you would have these frontal assaults, where first there would be a massive artillery bombardment on the opposing trench side. Then, presumably, there would be a closely followed upon infantry assault, with the artillery providing attacking infantry cover. But because of the primitive state of field telephones at the time period, this rarely occurred, and oftentimes attacks were not well coordinated. So what usually happened is there was a lull after the artillery barrage would level off, and then the attacking infantry would attack the opposing enemy's trench, by which point the opposing infantry, more often than not, had returned back to their own trenches and had begun launching their own artillery to counter the incoming onslaught. Attacking infantry would then be mowed down by a combination of enemy artillery, getting trapped on barbed wire, in many cases getting literally sucked into these deep craters and the pools of water that they created. And so these attacks, more often than not, failed completely. In many cases, attacking infantry barely didn't even reach the opposing enemy's trenches before being forced to retire with severe losses. What would then follow was an equally predictable counter-assault. Another artillery barrage, another attack, that'd be broken up by machine guns, poison gas, artillery, etc. And so this kind of deadly but ultimately futile routine played out for the better part of 3.5 years, between September of 1914 and the spring of 1918. And so, very little changes during this time period. Very little ground is given or taken away, and the trench lines remain effectively static. And this, of course, is horrific for the people who are forced to endure this. Many go insane. Many develop what we today call PTSD, but which in those days was known as shell shock. And like I said, entire new genres of art and literature and poetry emerge from the horrors of the trenches as people try to find ways of, you know, coping with and, processing their experiences, living in trenches filled with mud, lice, rats, in some cases with, people's hands sticking out from the sides of the mud of the trench walls, the stench of death everywhere, the lack of trees, all kinds of things. It's a really, it is quite literally a horrorscape. And of course, over time, this causes people's morale to crack, as do the massive casualties that you see in battles like the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916, and the Battle of Verdun that same year, British and French battles, respectively. So by 1917, things are going bad for the Allies. On the Eastern Front, the Russians are collapsing. Within a few months, there will be revolution in Russia, and then another revolution a few months after that. And by March of 1918, the Russians will exit the war altogether as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But things aren't going very well in the Western Allies either. As I mentioned, the French army mutinies in the spring of 1917, effectively rendering large portions of it ineffective for much of the duration of the year, which forces the British to take up the slack, which their population cannot support. And the British become so desperate that they end up actually drafting people that they had previously rejected for military service on account of poor eyesight or bad teeth or various other sorts of deficiencies. So things are pretty bad for the Allies when the U.S. enters the war. But the U.S. is not really in any position to provide any immediate relief to the Allies. The one thing that the U.S. does not have great difficulty in doing as it marshals its resources and mobilizes to fight the war is converting the civilian industrial economy to fight the war. As I mentioned previously, by 1917, already much of the Allied war infrastructure is heavily reliant on supplies coming from the United States. And so for many American manufacturers, it's just a matter of making minor changes to what they're already making for the Western Allies to equip the new the new American army that's rapidly being raised and trained. So that part's not that difficult. The difficult part is creating a battle-ready army. Now, to that end, President Wilson does sign a Selective Service Act in the spring of 1917 that does allow the U.S. to draft people for military service. Ultimately, as a result of this, by the end of the war, the U.S. Army will have gone from a peacetime force of less than 100,000 people, about 80,000 people, or roughly one day's casualty figures from the Battle of the Somme, to a massive force of nearly 5 million men, of whom about half would end up being deployed overseas by the end of the conflict. About half that total comes from drafts, and about another half comes from voluntary enlistments, roughly speaking. Of course, drafting people is one thing, training them is another. There simply weren't enough experienced NCOs and officers and regular soldiers to train and equip this new army in such a short period of time. And so substantial amounts of help had to be depended upon from civilian areas of the economy in American society, including groups like the YMCA, various progressive organizations, relief organizations, settlement houses, what have you, contributed people to help training this new army. As a result, American forces, when they did enter the conflict, are imbued with a deep level of idealism and, kind of this eagerness that would ultimately prove to be infectious. to the rest of the Allies. That's really the major American contribution to World War One, as much as anything else. When American forces arrive in Europe, they provide this massive injection of enthusiasm and fighting spirit into badly demoralized Allied armies on the Western Front. And so that proves to be, in many ways, as significant, if not more significant, than the actual military contributions that American forces make in the last few months of the war, which are, in and of themselves, quite significant. Um, so it takes a while, though, to train this army and to begin shipping it overseas. No American forces are involved in any major battles in the first year of the war, in 1917. And that partly is because when American forces arrive in France, they have to then be trained again by French and British officers and NCOs in the specifics of trench fighting. Now, this creates a bit of a dilemma for the United States and for the man appointed to command the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, John J. Pershing. Pershing was a career Army officer who had fought in the Spanish-American War. He had actually been present at the same battle as Theodore Roosevelt, the Battle of San Juan Hill, and had led an expedition the previous year into the deserts of Mexico to hunt for Pancho Villa. Pershing, when he arrived in France, was determined that American forces would fight as a intact national army. That is to say, he did not want American forces to be sent in to simply fill gaps in the armies of the French or British armies that had been decimated by 3.5, almost 4 years of trench warfare. And so that in and of itself creates a conflict between Pershing and the Allied High Command that delays the entry of American forces into the actual fighting, but also requires them to undergo more training because they can't just be kind of receive the same sort of on-the-job training that new replacements would under those circumstances. So as a result of all these things, the American Expeditionary Force, when it arrives in France, doesn't really do much for the first few months it's there, other than training and sightseeing. But that all changes rather dramatically in March of 1918, when the Germans launched this massive spring offensive that they call Operation Michael. The Germans basically, specifically the head of the German Army Command, General Erich Ludendorff, his belief was that with the exit of the Russians from the war by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and the fact that American forces still apparently weren't ready to enter the fight, he figures, strike while the iron's hot, launch this attack on the Western Allies, use reinforcements that are now available from the East, and launch this massive offensive against the French and the British armies in the West. And this offensive does completely take the British and French armies completely by surprise, and it does result in the Germans initially advancing significantly, advancing further in a matter of weeks than any armies had advanced in the previous 3.5 years of the conflict. However, Ludendorff's assumption that American forces were not ready to enter the conflict proved to be mistaken. And ultimately, it's at this point, arguably right there in the nick of time, that American forces actually do enter the battle against German armies in the spring of 1918. And their presence in these battles in the spring and early summer of 1918 proves to be very significant, if not decisive. American forces help check German advances in a number of places, most notably the heroic stand of the Marines at the Battle of Belleau Wood in May and early June of 1918. The 1st Infantry Division's attack of German positions in Cantigny, other attacks at Château-Thierry and various other places. American forces ultimately helped check the German advance. And by June of 1918, when the Germans attempt to launch their last offensive, 60 miles north of Paris at the Second Battle of the Marne, more than 250,000 American soldiers enter that fight and ultimately prove decisive in breaking up the German advance and allowing the Allies to effectively turn the tables on the Germans at that point. Now, after the Second Battle of the Marne, when American forces helped hold off and push back that last German offensive, the Allies begin turning the tables on the Germans, and they enter onto a general counteroffensive that'll continue all the way until the end of the war. Um, and it's at this point that American forces really begin entering the war in massive numbers in the last 100 days of the conflict. Um, by the time all is said and done, more than 2.5 million American soldiers would have been sent to and deployed on battlefields in France, the largest American fighting forces that had ever been assembled at that point. And ultimately, some of the battles that would result from this would and still remain the largest battles that American forces have ever fought, um, including battles fought later in World War II and battles in the previous century during the American Civil War. So, following the failed German offensives of the spring and early summer of 1918, American, British, and French forces launched their own counteroffensives against the Germans. And several of these counteroffensives are led by American forces, including a counteroffensive at Saint Mihiel in September of 1918, and then an even larger American counteroffensive in the Meuse-Argonne forest, which begins in late September and which lasts all the way up until the November 11th armistice. This final offensive of the war, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, is generally considered to be, still to this day, the largest battle that American forces have ever been deployed into fighting. And it's during this battle that the overwhelming majority of American combat casualties are suffered in these final 45 days of the conflict. Ultimately, the American counteroffensives, coupled with other Allied offensives in other parts of the Western Front, eventually break through the German lines and finally break through the 4-year-long impasse of trench warfare. And so by the first week of November, things are looking very bad for the Germans. American, British, and French forces appear to be poised to enter German territory itself, possibly enter even Germany itself. And so at this point, things move very, very rapidly as a result of the rapidly turned tables and the rapidly shifting fortunes in the war. And the Germans ultimately decide to seek an armistice. The Kaiser abdicates in the first week of November of 1918 after extensive riots in Germany due to years-long shortages of food and the collapse of the German army on the Western Front. And so finally, they agree to an armistice, which brings a temporary end to the fighting on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day, or the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So the fighting ends promptly at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. Part of the reason the Germans had agreed to this armistice was because of a speech that President Woodrow Wilson had delivered just a few months earlier in the United States, in which he outlined his vision for a post-war society. This speech, as its name suggests, consisted of 14 points, the 14-point speech. And in that very well-received speech, Wilson had advocated for a more humanitarian approach to international conflict going forward, to an end to secret treaties, an end to freedom of the seas, an end to all the kind of internal politicking that had created the First World War. But most importantly of all, Wilson had called for the creation of a new international delegation, a League of Nations, to arbitrate future disputes and to prevent incidents like the one in Sarajevo in June of 1914 that had produced the First World War from turning into full-scale conflicts. And so, feeling that with Wilson at the table, and with the well-received response to the 14 points in Europe, um, that it rep- that Germany might be given a fair shake if they agreed to a negotiated into the war, rather than fighting to the bitter end. And so ultimately, it was because of Wilson's 14 points and the spirit of optimism and international cooperation that they represented that the Germans, the hastily formed German government that forms after the Kaiser abdicates, opts to seek an armistice and a negotiated peace treaty rather than continuing the fight. That decision, in and of itself, would prove to be to bear bitter fruit in the form of the peace treaty that would follow, and which would formally conclude the conflict, the Treaty of Versailles. That treaty would be very, very different than the kind of magnanimous and internationalist approach advocated by Woodrow Wilson, and would, in and of itself, in the long run, sow the seeds for an even bigger, even bloodier, and even more disastrous conflict in Europe within less than 20 years, World War II. We'll talk about that, the Treaty of Versailles, and how the optimistic hopes of Woodrow Wilson and the United States ultimately came to naught in the next video.